There we
Hey
go.
everybody, this is Chuck Marone with Strong Talk. Welcome. We're going to make it through a whole episode here without anybody logging off unintentionally.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, we'll see. I'm really excited. We had a good time last week, and we've got a good guest and a good topic this week. We're going to talk about how to make housing more affordable. Before we get going, I want to let everybody know that right now as we talk, there is a conversation going on the Strongtowns Slack page. You can go to strongtowns.slack.com, I think, or you can go to strongtowns.org and scroll down to the bottom, and there's a link for our discussion board. To get signed up for that, in the channel Strong Talk, we're going to have an ongoing conversation during this, and then when we're done, at least Rachel and I, and maybe Nolan, but I know I will be over there to continue the conversation. I also want to say, in the last couple of days, we've gotten hit with quite a few people who have said on Facebook, on Twitter, who are you? Who are these people? Who and kind of the next step was, who is funding you? What like dark shadow funder is paying for Strong Towns to exist? And these are kind of, we're in this real partisan transition period, and everything's kind of weird and awkward. And I want to just say to those people, we are funded by our members. We, don't have any dark, surreptitious, black ops funder under the hood. We've got a very small budget. We've got a very small staff. We're doing kind of miracles with that. And our funding comes from two sources. Comes from one, members who give donations to us, and we thank you very much and appreciate that. And then some of the events that we do around the country. The next one will be in Kalamazoo, Michigan. You can get a list of those on our website as well. So if you're interested in supporting us, don't look for that dark black, ops kind of person. To pick up the Slack, you go to strongtowns.org and click on membership, and you can become one of the people who's part of the shadow group funding us. All right, I want to get started this week by introducing Nolan Gray. Nolan is actually from Kentucky, but is coming with us today from New Jersey, where he's attending grad school at Rutgers. He writes for Market Urbanism. Nolan, welcome to the podcast, or the.
Thanks for having me.
I'm in the podcast mode.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's good to be back. I was on the podcast, I think, last year, right? So
I know you were. It was a good one. Also joining us from Milwaukee, Rachel Quidnow. Rachel, welcome to Strong Talk.
Thank you.
Nolan, you ran an article this week about Lexington, Kentucky, where you're from, and you were responding to some of the things that you had seen brought up over your holiday break there in your local newspaper. Can you talk a little bit about the urban growth boundary and what the problems are? And you came up with 3 ways that these problems could be dealt with. Can you kind of go over that a little bit just to kick things off?
Sure. So Lexington, Kentucky, it's second largest city in Kentucky. Most people only know Louisville, and they always ask if I'm from Louisville. I'm not. I'm from Lexington, the better city, in my opinion. It's grown a lot over the last 50 or so years. I think it's nearly doubled in size since 1970 alone. I'm in New Jersey now. That's not a common story, but a lot of people from the South and out West have heard about this, cities that are growing really rapidly. And so this is a good thing in one sense. In another sense, it's a bad thing because the current sort of urban planning regime, very typical sort of Euclidean zoning, has restrained the housing supply in Lexington. Lexington also has what's called an urban growth boundary. I'll just call it a UGB from now on, where basically growth can't extend beyond a certain point. And cities adopt these for all kinds of reasons. Some cities adopt them as a fiscal measure, so they're worried about the cost of more infrastructure. This is a story that Strong Towns people probably know pretty well. They do it to preserve open space, to preserve natural habitats. You see that a lot out west. And then in the case of Lexington, they adopted it to protect horse farms along the east, north, and west side of the city. So obviously, people know about the horse industry in Kentucky, and it was really important to the city to protect it at that time. At the time they adopted it.
Could I ask you a quick question, just because I'm interested? urban growth boundaries are not common across the country. Is this something that is, I guess I was kind of surprised to learn that there was one in a Kentucky city. Is this pretty common in Kentucky, or is this, a rare example?
This is a rare example. So Lexington was actually the first U.S. city to adopt an urban growth boundary. And I'm not a historian of the city, but my understanding was that in the 60s, when it was adopted, the horse industry was worried about the horizontal expansion of the city. And so the UGB was expressly to keep, single family subdivisions from bumping up against horse farms. So it's a very peculiar special interest. Most cities don't have a horse industry special interest lobbying for a growth boundary, even in Kentucky. So,
right.
So it was kind of a weird sort of special interest thing. It wasn't real, as I understand, it wasn't really environmentalist driven. It wasn't really sort of activist driven. It was really more driven by the horse industry. If anybody knows about that, knows more about it, if I've said anything wrong, just correct me in the Slack. But that's sort of the story that I always heard. And so this is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's a constant feature of U.S. or of Lexington housing policy. So people are constantly saying we need to expand the urban growth boundary and allow for more housing. I think that's an interesting debate and probably worth having. But I think most people are kind of tired of it. So like, it's been a constant feature of housing policy for the last 50 years. So my sort of take in the piece was to say, forget about that. We're not really moving the ball on it. We're expanding it occasionally, and that's good when we can reach compromises on it. But outside of that, it's just this really unproductive argument that shapes so much of politics now. So I wanted to look at where can we agree to expand more housing. And so in the piece, I look at 3 ways that we could increase housing without having to even have the growth boundary debate.
I want to talk about the first one, because you suggested that there should be more accessory dwelling units, and it's something that I agree. I mean, I agree with. I think we would be better off if by right cities were allowed to do this. And in fact, when when the White House last year came out with their recommendations for changes in local zoning, I think that was the top one. It was like number 1 or number 2, that this should be something that should be allowed by right. It's interesting because the pushback that I get a lot of times when I bring that up is that, well, okay, that's great for, college students. And that's great for single people, be they, poor or not. But it really isn't going to help the poor family. And I kind of get that argument to a degree. But I also, kind of push back and wonder how many people are single people households that are living in multifamily homes because there really isn't a good quality alternative. And how many people, I think of my wife's grandmother, who, when she got elderly and needed some help, instead of moving into an apartment or assisted living facility, moved into what was essentially like an accessory apartment at my wife's aunt's house. And that seemed to work out, really, really well, and freed up a single family home. What would you say, to people who push back and say, well, it's just for single people and college kids, basically?
I mean, I would say even if that's the case, that's not necessarily a problem, because what's happening in Lexington right now is that those young single professionals are just buying homes and not really using them fully. They're just buying them because that's really the only way you can live in downtown, or they're buying condos that might be able to support a larger family or something like that, or renting out apartments and driving up rents that might be able to serve lower middle income families. So if you have these people moving into accessory dwelling units, that's not a problem. That's freeing up other housing. And it's also keeping people perhaps in the neighborhood where they want to live. But I would push back that that's even the case. So I had a lot of friends who lived in downtown Lexington, inner suburban neighborhoods in Lexington. And I mentioned this in the piece, Kenwick, not Kenwick, I think it's Hollywood. There's a neighborhood called Hollywood. Lexington people know what I'm talking about, where there are a whole bunch of non-conforming accessory dwelling units. And you see all kinds of people living in them. They were I think a friend of mine who rented one out, it was something like to like just the 30, a couple in their 30s. So I think that you're probably going to get a lot of diversity. There's no question that it might be best suited to college students or retirees. But no matter who's living in them, that sort of eases demand on maybe some of the more vulnerable neighborhoods that are further away.
And the other benefit is to the person who owns the dwelling unit. Like that's another source of income that maybe allows you to stay in a house that's becoming more expensive, or just in general, another source of income, which is always helpful.
They've done research on this, and as I understand, most of the people who do rent, like a substantial portion of people who rent out accessory dwelling units, do it to be able to stay in their current home. So
yeah.
You talked in the piece about the increasing the ability to have residential in the downtown and making the downtown mixed use. Can you just explain that a little bit? I found the one photo that you had to be fascinating because on the one side of the street, it showed like an old traditional downtown that I kind of liked. I mean, visually, I thought aesthetically, like it was really nice. And then the other side was this high intensity, modern apartment complex that just, I think from a bulk standpoint didn't offend me, but from an architectural standpoint didn't seem to be a good complement to the character and flavor of the community. I don't know if you've got a reaction to that, or like what talk a little bit about your thinking with that particular strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think South Limestone, which is what I show in the piece, the west side of it, I think it's a fantastic street. But if you look down past it, sort of for one, the whole street is actually kept very low. So this is a very high demand area. A lot of people want to live in the area. They're building a lot of these mixed use apartments kind of all over the place. And on the right are dorms, student housing for the University of Kentucky. They're subject to, I think they call it like R3, residential 3. It's just high density. And they sort of have a little bit more bargaining power than the typical developer just because the University of Kentucky is like, the beating heart of the city. But with the piece, I'm just trying to show sort of the peculiar results of these zoning restrictions. If you look one block over, you see the same thing where there's a really dense mixed use development, which probably required a lot of negotiating, a lot of work between a really large developer, probably from out of town in many cases, who could afford to do the compromises and get the sort of discretionary review through. And then you have blocks like this where very low, it's only commercial. On the other side of the black building, there's a McDonald's. That's just a giant parking lot. Maybe if I could do it over again, I probably would have pointed at the McDonald's. But again, people who drive down that street kind of know what I'm talking about, where there have been teardowns along this street, and they've been replaced by the only thing that's legal, which is like sprawl development kind of McDonald's surrounded by a drive-through speedway, surrounded by 50 parking spots. Yeah. And I'm just sort of trying to point out in the piece that what we would want that block to be doing is to gradually be getting a little bit bigger, gradually supporting more and more apartments, more and more businesses. But what it's doing right now is it's stuck as it was built in 1950, which I agree isn't that bad and it's aged well. But then when it changes at all, it changes into this significantly worse form of development. And I just think that's a huge opportunity that the city's missing. They have, the standard B1 zoning where it requires setbacks and low lot coverage and all these parking requirements. They're requiring it in their downtown, and they're basically saying it's illegal to develop the kind of downtown that we once had. So I'm just sort of trying to make the case that if you like this kind of thing, legalize it.
Definitely.
I want to talk a little bit about the cultural part of this, because to me, it seems like there's a broad consensus amongst policy people. And I guess I'll refer back to that White House document that came out last year. I think that it was broadly embraced by policy people because, yeah, we want, increased density, we want performance standards, we want ADUs, the whole like litany of thing. But the pushback you get, and I'm interested to hear about the urban growth boundary in Lexington and how it's viewed kind of culturally. But the pushback I get goes a little bit to the Strong Towns party analogy. People we don't want density. We don't want, more people in our we don't want more traffic. We don't want more people. We like things the way they are. And I think culturally, I get that. You know, if you are living in a neighborhood where you've got a park and a library and good fire protection.
Chuck, frozen.
Uh-oh.
No. This is what happened last time. Okay, everyone stand by. Sorry about that. Well, let me go back then to your list of 3 different solutions. And the last one that you talked about was parking requirements, which I think for people who are probably watching this video probably already know why eliminating parking requirements helps to create housing. But I think that argument probably takes a few steps to explain to someone who isn't familiar with these issues. Like, what does parking have to do with housing? And like, why does a lot of parking lots mean we can't have housing? And somebody left a long, kind of angry comment on the article about parking, which doesn't need to be repeated. But yeah, I wonder if you want to answer kind of the question that they said. Well, I'll read like a tiny bit of it. They said, please understand that if you eliminate parking requirements, you are neither eliminating parking demand nor new parking lots, unless you're recommending prohibiting surface parking altogether, which is not what I'm reading. So yeah, do you want to talk about why that, why just eliminating is a good step versus like preventing them altogether?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I want to start by drawing, I think, a really important distinction that gets a lot of people upset when it's confused. I'm not saying like prohibit parking.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is like stop forcing people to build parking that they otherwise would not want to build. So on its face, I'm kind of feeling like this, maybe people, when they understand that, they'll kind of see this as a less controversial claim. But in terms of, there's still going to be demand for parking. Definitely. The question is, how do we provide the parking? Who has to pay for the parking? All right, Chuck, you back in?
It's always me.
Yeah, we were just talking about the third tip or advice that Nolan offered. In terms
parking.
Of, parking requirements.
Yeah. So the big question, I would say, it's the big challenge is it's an epistemological question. Who has the knowledge about how much parking do you have to build? Who is in the best position to tell you how much parking you should build? On the one hand, we have a planning document that we have today, which for the most part was written in the 60s. Actually, probably for the most part, much earlier, 30s or 40s. I don't know when they first wrote it. They revised it in the 60s. And as far as I can tell, parking requirements in the whole haven't really been touched since. So on the one hand, we have this sort of planning document that was written in the 60s. A lot of things have changed since the 60s, as you may know. And then today we have developers who are out there building properties, who are out there experimenting with communities. These are small developers who are active in the community. They've lived in these neighborhoods in many cases, and they have their own idea about how much parking would be built. I would say just sort of on its face, there's a good case to be made for letting the developers determine how much parking they think their development's going to need. Now there's still going to be demand for parking. So the concern might be that developers will underprovide it. They have every incentive not to underprovide it, but let's say that they do. Then the city could look at other serious ways of addressing the problem. So in Lexington, there's a lot of sort of unpriced, free street parking around that sort of sits empty, and there's big giant wars among students and commuters to try to get it. It causes a lot of traffic. The city could very easily sort of set up a system where there was clear pricing. The city could tell you which garages were available, which were going to be cheaper, which were more expensive. The city's already been overhauling its parking management, and I think they've done a pretty good job with it. But there are easier ways to address the problem than say, if you're going to build any commercial here, you got to build X number of parking spots for every single seat you have in your restaurant, or you need to build, 4 parking spots for every duplex.
Yeah.
There's like no question to me that there are going to be mistakes in the new system, but there's also no question to me that there are massive mistakes being made in the current system. So I'm just saying that the city can investigate, ways to ease the parking restrictions, and they already have been. So if you look in the ordinance, you see basically 25 years of the city saying, oh, no parking requirements here, no parking requirements there, no parking requirements if you put bike parking. The city already knows this needs to be done. And so I'm writing the piece for a public audience. I'm writing the piece for people who drive their cars. And I used to commute to Kentucky campus. I know it is awful trying to find a parking spot. That's why I started commuting by bike. There was no ideology to it. It was, I can't find a parking spot. I am getting really mad every single day. I totally understand that. But there are huge costs associated with requiring parking in the sort of ham-handed way that we're doing it today.
Yeah, and then I think the next step is talking about how to use the existing, surface parking lots that are just going to waste, sitting empty, and turn those into housing or commercial options.
Yeah.
Which I think is like the next step in the parking conversation.
There are a lot of blocks in some of the best neighborhoods in Lexington that I think are really hurt by this surface parking. And that's a huge opportunity to build just a better city.
To me, I feel like it's clear that cities can't do parking management without price signals. Price signals give us information that, the way we go about collecting it now just doesn't. I mean, I can't tell you how many cities I've been in where you've been at the meeting and they're talking about parking standards, and the data that you have is some guy who stands up and says, well, I tried to go downtown and I couldn't find a parking spot. And literally that's the impetus for setting the parking standard. It seems to me like we, if you're going to have a policy that's going to require literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to be spent by developers providing something of marginal value utility, you should at least be doing it with some level of data, beyond the guy who shows up at the meeting who couldn't find a parking spot. There should be some type of feedback system, that is financially based, that would allow you to know, like, hey, we have these meters here. They're never full. They're always empty. Like, maybe we don't have a parking problem. And I suspect Lexington has a lot of unused parking spots.
Yeah, I mean, if we're playing around with anecdotal evidence, just go look on Google Maps, and you'll see a lot of surface parking lots downtown, a lot of parking garages. Then go down there and look on a weekday. So look when they should be used at their absolute maximum. Go at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, and you will see a lot of parking garages, a lot of parking lots that sit empty. I mean, the Rep Arena parking lot, which is the big parking lot downtown, we could set up a system where people drive down there, they park there, and then they hop on a bus to wherever they need to go around downtown. That might be a more efficient system than saying we're going to have a giant parking lot around every single building, for example. There are ways to do this that don't involve, I think, listening to the one person complaining and then saying, yeah, we're gonna require more parking here, or we're gonna build another parking garage, for example. This is another sort of constant feature of the discussion, is everyone's always saying we need more parking garages downtown. I mean, I think I don't know if I included this in the piece, but I counted up the number of parking garages just within a block of Main Street. I think it was something like 15.
Right.
These are 15 garages that are 5-6 stories high.
There really not many places to visit, right?
Right. Some of them have commercial on the bottom, and most of them are just parking. Sorry, what were you saying?
No, I feel like, the argument over the urban growth boundary is one thing. And, we haven't really touched on that, and I don't really want to. I mean, I think that goes in a whole different direction. I feel like what you're arguing, though, and I agree with this, if this is what you're saying, is that, hey, we're not really making very good use of what we've already got here. And if we just tweak some things, we could get a whole lot more out of what we've already got in the ground, in place, and it really wouldn't be disruptive. It really would fit into who we are. And I feel like that's the story for almost every city in North America, really.
And I think it's important to note that everything you proposed is basically along the lines of make a way for this to happen. Change the laws so that it's easier for someone, if they wanted to do it, to do it. Not let's spend $20 million building, huge mixed use apartment buildings downtown. It's just let's allow that to actually happen if somebody wants to.
But let's find a developer we can hand out a bunch of subsidies to.
Yeah.
Rachel, you wrote a piece this week about the $1 house in Milwaukee, And I had run that piece on our social media feed, but then you followed up with the original article, but then you followed up with kind of something more in depth. Can you explain that a little bit? Because I feel like Milwaukee is trying to get at this affordable housing issue too, but they're doing it in a really, I want to say, strange way. Talk a little bit about that.
I mean, this is a little bit of a different issue because the program that they started is in like a very depressed neighborhood with a ton of vacant foreclosed homes. So the city had some funding, I think, from the state originally it was to demolish a bunch of these homes, and then they kind of changed it based on interest from leaders to be a program where they would use the money that was going to go to the demolition to instead provide up to $10,000 to developers to rehab those homes, and they would all be sold for just $1. And I think like the reason I became aware of this is because there was a bunch of press about a local meeting that they had about this that was open to the public, and a lot of people were under the impression that they could buy just a $1 home and then get the subsidy to help renovate it. But then it turned out that the program was just geared towards people who were professional developers and were going to be able to buy, you're required to buy at least 5 homes as part of the program. So it just seems like kind of a disappointing missed opportunity to, allow a bunch of residents to become homeowners. Instead, now it's just money going to more developers. The upper limit is 50 homes. So theoretically, 2 developers could participate in this entire program of 100 homes and just, buy up a bunch of homes, get a bunch of money to renovate them, and just make that all back in rent. So I don't know. I mean, I know I'm being kind of an idealist, and somebody commented on the piece and said as much, like, don't you know that all these residents are going to need to have training? They don't know how to be contractors and all that. And I get that, but I don't know.
They don't know how to rehab a home, how to fix your place. That was the fascinating thing to me, was that, you have all these people lined up saying, wow, if you are giving a home, if I could buy a home for $1 and acquire $10,000 worth of funding so that I can like put my own sweat equity into this and fix this place up, I'm there. And they said, no, you got to be a big time developer. You've got to buy a bunch of them and do this.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating because the comment from the city staff was something along the lines of, well, we couldn't manage it if it was just regular people. We have to work with the contractors.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, maybe that's a problem with your department, right? I mean, I get how it's easier.
Like, what's your priority?
I get how it's easier to have a licensed contractor come in with a set of engineered, architecturally designed plans. And, you don't have to get out from behind your desk and go meet some guy who doesn't know, what the electrical code is. I realize that, like, that's a lot harder. But it seems to me like, why don't you, I could see this program saying, buy the home for $1. We'll, reimburse you, 1 to 2, for every $1, for every $2 you put in, we'll give you $1 back. And you go out and fix up this house, and, we'll be good up to $10,000. And I don't know why that would be so hard to administer, actually.
Yeah. And I think the particularly frustrating part about it too is that the other component of this program is an employment aspect, where anyone who buys the homes has to hire at least one unemployed or underemployed resident to work at least 500 hours on the home. So it's like, okay, you created this program to just like temporarily hire low-wage workers when you could have created a program that would allow those people to become homeowners and like rehab their own homes. That's kind of
one of my favorite Chris Rock quotes is, Shaq is rich. The guy who signs Shaq's check is wealthy. And it's a little bit along the lines of, well, we'll give you a job, we'll find you a job, and it'll be some kind of subsidy that these developers have to come up with. I'd much rather help poor people start to build their own wealth incrementally. I feel like there's a lot better ways to do that. Nolan, I feel like I interrupted you there.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I mean, I understand why it happens, but I think it kills me that every program has to address every single issue. I totally get that there are people in the neighborhood that need jobs, but like, this is going to make the main purpose of the legislation just a little bit harder, because now you have to go out and find someone, and you might not be able to find someone who has the skills needed. That might involve a lot of time and effort on your end, and really you're not really getting much benefit from it. So I guess that's just pick the priority, you know, like have a separate program for the people in the community who don't have jobs, and then say to the people who want to rehabilitate the house, great, go do it. You know what I mean? I don't see why everything has to address every issue.
Right.
Yeah.
I really like the approach that Buffalo, New York has taken. And I can't say that I'm fully like know every nuance of the program, but it was kind of explained to me when I was there as essentially like a Homestead Act kind of thing. You know, the original Homestead Act was you go out, you get a piece of property, you know, we'll take it from the Native Americans and give it to you. But, you know, once you get that piece of property, if you stay there for 7 years and improve it, it's yours. And in Buffalo, it was something along the lines of, we'll give you a house, and if you live in it for 5 years and, you know, put money into improving it, it will transfer the title to you after 5 years. And, you know, for poor neighborhoods, for neighborhoods where you have people who want to have a chance and want to start building their own wealth and are willing to, you know, put, as I used to say in college, when you have more time than money, you know, it doesn't do you any good to have something that costs a lot. It's better to have something where it's going to take a lot of time. Sanding boards, you know, fixing sheetrock, painting walls, putting in insulation. These take money, but even more so than that, they take a lot of time. And to me, I feel like, especially in poor neighborhoods, you have places where people would love to be able to turn idle time into wealth that they have and own and is their own. And I think we treat these problems too often as transactions, as opposed to opportunities to really like deeply empower people. And I feel like Buffalo captured that better than what this Milwaukee program is trying to do.
Another thing about this too, this is, I think, a broader trend that worries me, is building everything around large developers. You know, I mean, that's sort of the way that zoning's been done too, is where it's basically built around the large developer with a legal team who can deal with all the issues.
I couldn't agree more.
That's just, I think, a sort of mindset. I think the mindset needs to be, can a small developer or somebody who has no experience with this easily jump in and start making the city better? If they can't, you need to probably go back and redo it.
I feel like that's true from the top down. I mean, everything from our transportation investments to the way we do housing finance at the federal level, to the way banks and insurance companies deal with development, all the way down to zoning and the building code. You know, it's kind of like we've wired it to be really, I won't say easy for the big developer, but basically you have to be a big developer to get through this process. And if you're small, we're going to put up tons and tons of obstacles, even if what you're doing is really small. I mean, I've said many times, for the greenfield developer out on the edge of town looking to do 100 homes, it should be a very different process than the one person in town who's trying to buy the house across the street and rehab it into a duplex. I mean, that should be a much different process and a much different set of submissions, a much lower bar to clear. Yet often the rehab one in town is 10 times more onerous than the huge thing out on the edge, because the huge thing out on the edge is almost like, it's almost like a cookie cutter. I mean, it's almost like we're just stamping things we've done in the past.
And there's nothing wrong with that, but there's just this huge untapped opportunity in these cities. Like a lot of these cities that are, or a lot of these lots that are in downtown neighborhoods, they're non-conforming. So doing anything with the lot is going to require hundreds of hours of working with zoning boards and paying a legal team. So it's a shame, and it's the sort of mindset that comes out with this Milwaukee program, I think.
I think what you run into too in a lot of those places where we have non-conformities, and now we're getting deep into the zoning weeds, but
I'm pulling it up.
Yeah, no. Well, you create a lot of uncertainty for people. You know, if you're kind of a deep-pocketed developer, you know that you have access to people at City Hall. You know that the process, you understand what it takes to get a project approved, and you can essentially take a flyer on some of those things and push your way through it. If you're the small incremental developer and you have this huge unknown. The lot is non-conforming. What is the city going to allow me to do? That becomes a risk that's just too great of a barrier to cross.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think, in addition to your list of things, which this may apply to Lexington, it may not, but I know it applies to cities across the country. The more we can reduce that risk for the small incremental developer, the easier it's going to be for them to jump into the fray, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've reached the end of Strong Talk, and I only got bumped off the conversation once, so
That's pretty good.
yeah,
Next
we're
time's
getting
zero.
we're getting better. I have no idea. It's so dumb. We do Google Hangouts all the time, and I never get bumped off. And then we go live on air, and it's like, bam. Hey, Nolan, thanks a lot for joining us. I love having you on.
Good to
I
talk
love
to you,
chatting with you.
Nolan.
Okay, thanks for having me.
And
Thanks,
Rachel,
guys.
I will see you on the Slack chat. We'll be
good.
there in a couple minutes. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Take care.
All right, thank you.